All right, so this is the chapter 8 social construction of intimacy. Just going to do a brief audio review for you. Okay, so intimacy in a social context. So, intimacy is something that's shaped by society. A lot of social changes have influenced intimate relationships, which we're going to discuss throughout the whole lecture. So, people make decisions about intimate relationships within a social context. So, depending on your position in society, depending on our social location that we have and those different hierarchical structures, that's going to determine the way that we find love and what we think to be attractive or sexy. So the messages that we get from the larger society are mixed. We live in a very sexually prudish culture that stresses a narrow sexual standard for women to be pure and chaste virgins, while we use sexuality as a means to sell just about everything, right? So that can be super confusing as a mixed message, especially for young girls who get this kind of Madonna whore dichotomy. Not Madonna, the musician, but of course like the Madonna, right? This idea that you're supposed to be um, a virgin and a whore at the same time, right? To look, sexually experienced yet virginal, which is literally two complete opposite things, and that's very difficult to emulate. So that kind of puts girls in a very difficult situation. That whole lady in the streets, freak in the sheets kind of thing, this dichotomy that we create because of these kind of social prudish sexual roles that we have. So when it comes to this idea of the intimacy revolution, right, over the past several decades, there's been a new emphasis on relationships, and sexuality has emerged during this time to become part of this intimacy revolution. So, the purpose of marriage shifted. When it had previously been more about economic necessity, it became more about companionship. And of course, more recently, more about personal growth and fulfillment through this deeper intimacy. So, not only are macro level forces implicated in the contemporary need for intimacy, but they also shape our mate selection decisions. So some connect the rise of interracial and same-sex relationships in recent decades to more social independence for young people. So it's now expected that young adults are going to move out of their parents' home and live on their own before they get married. And it's during this time that most people are making their mate selections. So people that are farther from their family's influence are going to care less what their parents' approval is of their relationship context. So we also have separated our private selves from the public self that we display for others. And this separation creates a need for intimacy. So Goffman is the one arguing this through his dramaturgy or his impression management argument, right? That we have our front stage, we have our backstage, we have our face that we show to the world, and then we have who we truly are in the background, right? And so he's basically saying that since we have to put on a mask and pretend to be something within society, when we take that mask off, we need to have intimacy to do that in front of other people, right? So there's, only certain people that you're actually real with. And the rest of the time, you're kind of showing most people that mask. So intimate relationships really permit people to be themselves without being judged. So in the strive for intimacy, though, we often expect our intimate partner to be all things for us. So we have this cultural idea that this other person's going to complete us, that we expect them to complement us in every way. But in reality, each person is not half a person, but a full one. And the expectation for this person to be our everything is a recipe for disappointment. It's a major source of marital strain, and it contributes to large amounts of divorces that we see, right? This expectation that this one person could be everything, which of course is very much promoted through our culture in the media, but it's just not the case. It's a lot to put on one person. So when it comes to a heterosexual mate selection, there's a lot of factors that affect this, right? So while mate selection used to involve family and community, it's much more of an independent orientation today. So historically, relationships or marriages were arranged by parents to combine territories, right? To make financial arrangements that joined families together. Now, people find someone independent of their families, typically, right? And eventually bring them around their family once they've established their relationship. So this has changed dramatically just since, the 1900s. It's pretty interesting. When in the 1900s, it was customary to, quote, come calling, which was structured meeting between, a young woman and a young man under the watchful eyes of family members. We talked about this a little bit before, showing up, burning the candle, kind of hanging out, but having someone just sit there and watch you to supervise your interactions. By the 1920s, couples started to go out on dates far from their parents' supervision. So again, this had a lot to do with having cars and kind of people moving into more metropolitan areas where you had more opportunities to go out, things to do. If you live in a rural area, there's not much to do. So the initiation of dates shifted from a girl allowing a boy to come calling at her parents' house to a boy asking a girl out on a date because of the kind of larger structural shifts that were happening in the society. So girls didn't ask boys at the time because they were still considered second-class citizens, which is why, men's pay was related to them paying for dates because they made much more than women. So, by the middle of the 20th century, going steady was very common in high schools and colleges. And nowadays, parents have a lot less control over their young adults' decisions of mate selection. So historically, parents have had all the say. And as times changed and, there's still a custom of getting a father's blessing before proposing marriage, but that's no longer really the accepted custom that you have to do, but some people still choose to adhere to it. So things have really changed in the past few decades to allow young people more choices. So the importance of education obviously has had a lot of that for people postpone marriage until they're done getting their education. The decline of rural America and the lure of cities, right, really kind of changed the structure of dating. The changing work patterns in the economy, right, more freedom for women. These things affected this. So, during a historical move from the rural to the city, that came with it a changing ideology of marriage for romantic love. So when it comes to teen dating, fewer teens date now than in the past. The number of teens that never go on a date has risen considerably since 1900. As the dating patterns have changed, the percentage of teens who date frequently, defined as more than one a week, has fallen since 1900. So teen dating is associated with both positive and negative consequences. So, for some, teen dating brings confidence, autonomy, and a better knowledge of oneself. Like what you like and dislike about a mate. That's a process of trial and error, unfortunately, right? You learn from each relationship. So for other teens, frequent dating is associated with conflict with parents, more depression, lower academic motivation, and lower achievement than other teens. So it really depends on the characteristics and quality of the dating relationship as to whether it's a beneficial or negative outcome for the teenager themselves. So adolescents typically engage in what's called group dating in the 21st century. So typically, in adolescence, groups of young people will go out and do things together, like go out to the movies or school dances or, if you live local to Southern California, Disneyland, local fairs, festivities, things like that, where they go as a group, not necessarily like one person asking one person out on a date and having this very formalized kind of structured thing. It's usually just a group of teens hang out with another group of teens, and that's just kind of how that works. And of course, online dating is also now a significant development in contemporary mate selection. So these platforms are really new, right? So before these things existed, you were limited to dating the people in your extended social networks. But with new technology, of course, this has really given us a whole different way to understand the dating world, right? In a way of seeing people as whether you swipe left or right. So there's also variations in dating practices depending on groups. So when it comes to gender, we have certain expectations about who should ask whom on a date, who pays for the date, who initiates sex. Our traditional gender role expectations still structure our dating interactions. And so they remain that way in our expectations of who pays, who asks who out, who initiates sex, all those things. So there are expectations that men will pick where the date is, pick a woman up, be prepared to pay for the meals, while women are expected to take a while to get ready, to wait to be picked up, to be the recipient of any physical or sexual advances, but not the initiator. So this also leads to a lot of issues, in the larger rape culture, where we don't understand when these lines get blurred, often because of this kind of predatory nature of the patriarchal structure of what sex relationships are supposed to be. Instead of it being like two kind of equally footed individuals coming together, it's much more of a situation of having two different structures where one person is pursuing the other person and the other person is fending off advances. That's not a recipe for good, healthy interactions. So we can see this double standard when it comes to whether or not people actually date a lot of people. So, when a guy dates a lot of people, we call him, something very different than when a woman dates a lot of people. And dating, whether that's sexual relationships or not, right? We have this kind of assumption that if a woman spends any time with a man, that she's a whore, really. In the society, there's no other way to say it. I mean, we have plenty of words for it, right? Harlot, slut, tramp, trollop, all sorts of things. We have a million words. When it comes to boys, there's only a couple words that we have that are negative when it comes to these things. But that tends to be recent wording that is coming out of like newer youth culture, which is pretty interesting to see how this is starting to change linguistically in our own modern day. When it comes to social class, dating and courtship patterns vary by social class. So upper class youth are brought up in very exclusive communities with exclusive schools and country clubs and things like that control who they're exposed to, right? So living a very highly segregated life, parents have a lot of control in arranging their children's marriages, if not directly, then by making sure they're associating with quote unquote good families, meaning rich families, so that they will marry someone of a similar social class and maintain their financial privilege and segregation in the society. So middle class youth, in comparison to rich youth, have more freedom to choose, right, than those upper class youth, but their parents are still more involved than lower class youth. So middle class youth are more likely to attend schools, church, or community-sponsored events than lower class youth. And lower class youth are less likely to date in structured activities, but are more likely to gather in the street or bowling alleys or bars or places like that to meet other people. So obviously that has an issue with it. So, there's this interesting stratification within dating, what's called the principle of least interest. So whoever cares the least about continuing the relationship holds the most power in it. So whoever has the highest status in the relationship, depending on how unequal it is, has the power to control their partner or demand certain conditions to maintain the relationship. So when it comes to race, interracial relationships are likely to form in integrated settings such as the military, metropolitan areas, colleges and universities, places where people come in contact with groups of people that may be different racial or ethnic groups. And so, in the general U.S., people tend to be pretty segregated racially, so they tend to only come in contact with people of their own racial grouping or ethnic grouping. So, the less you interact, the less likely you are to marry someone. So interracial dating is much more common and accepted in the U.S. today, but it was only a couple decades ago when the miscegenation laws went away, right? And people were even allowed to marry outside the race at all. So clearly this is still an ongoing changing thing. And when it comes to immigration status, first-generation immigrants are more traditional in their relationship behaviors, while second-generation immigrants are more likely to have adopted the norms of American youth culture because they grew up within it. All right, so some other factors in mate selection. So legal, right? Until 1967, 17 states had miscegenation laws, making it illegal to marry someone of a different race. And of course, same-sex marriage that was illegal until it was just recently made legal across all 50 states, right? There are legal regulations that prohibit marriage between close relatives, right? States vary on what they consider close. For example, fun fact, in California, it is legal to marry your first cousin. Gross. In some states, it's also okay to marry your first cousin. In some, you can, but only if you're infertile or over 50 to 65, depending on the state. And in others, it's illegal to marry your first cousin, right? So again, the law is going to shape your available pool of mates or whether you marry your cousin. Ugh, just don't. But anyway, plenty of fish. All right, so then there's some other terminology from the book, are just kind of different ways that we understand the coupling of people. So hypogamy just means that people tend to marry other people who are similar to them, right? So, this homogamy thing is really important because it's not necessarily like a prejudice thing, right? It's an idea that you're more likely to be segregated in the way that you live, so you're more likely to be around people that are like you. So that's who you end up falling in love with, right? So just means that, people that are similar to you in race, religion, ethnicity, social class, people tend to end up with similar mates. So hypogamy is when you move upward in social class through marriage, right? Like marrying up, right? And hypergamy is when you marry down in social class, right? So, there's certain qualities that are important that, when men and women talk about what's important in selecting a mate, this includes mutual attraction, right? That's a big one. If you're not attracted to a person, you're not going to be able to really date them. Being in love, right? Having someone that has dependable characteristics, right? Like they're very there for you, they're dependable. Emotionally stable, right? That's a big one. Someone that's kind of clear and can weather life's problems. Someone who's mature, right? And the textbook argues that perhaps now partners are also looking for a partner that's successful in the labor market because of the changes in the economy that make it a lot harder to live. When it comes to structural influences, the availability of marriageable partners is a big part of that, right? You can only marry who you can, who's eligible. And there's a variety of group affiliations that we have. So the more varied affiliations with different groups that you have, the more opportunities you have to meet and stay in contact with people that are, dissimilar. So people may marry outside their social group because of their multiple interwoven group affiliations, right? So you might meet someone through your church or through your whatever, like through your school organization or whatever it is. And as a result, that's how you fall in love with that person and marry them. So, schools themselves can play a major role in finding a potential mate. So high school and then, college further narrows your choice of mates. Since college attendance is strongly associated with parents' socioeconomic status, it's likely that college students will choose someone similar to marry because that's who's available. Despite our belief that who we marry is a personal choice, structural influences remain strong in our mate selection. So the sociology of sexuality is an emerging area of research that examines how society shapes the expression of sexual desire through cultural images and social institutions. So the social constructionist approach examines the underlying social motivations and mechanisms that shape human social relationships and society. So the tenets of social construction theory are that human sexuality varies across time, space, and the life of any individual, and that although sexuality is the site of our most intimate experiences, it is socially controlled and bound up with the basic inequalities that configure the structure of society, namely class, race, and gender, but of course a lot of others as well. So biology alone does not determine human sexuality. We socially determine what's considered sexy. So, sexuality is not strictly about biology. Activities that are condemned in one society may be encouraged in another. So sexuality is not about biology. So I'm going to show you a clip here from a, TED Talk from a couple of years ago that just really kind of examines how cultural narratives about sexuality that we see in pornography can really infect our own understandings or beliefs about our sexuality.
I stopped watching porn for two reasons, basically. The first one was that porn brought so much anger and violence into my private fantasies. And these were anger and violence that were not there originally to begin with. And I did not want that for me anymore. This was not me, and I decided to just put an end to it. Easier said than done. I'll get to it later, but the second reason was that I came to realizing, I think, that only by watching porn, I take part in creating a demand for filmed prostitution, because that's what porn really is, filmed prostitution. Porna stands for prostitute, graphia stands for documentation, and prostitution was nobody's childhood dream, okay? That it is always a result of trouble and distress. Now, I became aware of that gradually when I was volunteering with men and women in prostitution, some of them victims of human traffic, serving aid in brothels, under the bridge, in street corners. But you don't really need to do all that in order to understand how this mechanism of porn and prostitution works. Because porn as a genre, it's not about erotica or healthy sexual communication. It is all about male domination of women, subordinance of women, not only as a sexual practice, as a way of being. as a genderial hierarchy in this world. Like if we would ask porn, if we were to ask porn, how does it define something as sexual? What qualifies, what defines something as sexual? Porn would laugh in our face. What defines sexual? Whatever men find arousing. Men find it arousing to choke a woman, to have brutal sex without one touch, hug, kiss, tender caress. Well, then it is sexual. It arouses men to see a woman or a child cry. It is sexual. It arouses men to rape a woman. Well, then it is sexual. In every mainstream porn gallery on the web, we can find the rape category, side by side with the humiliation category, abuse category, crying category, and so on. And this is all as if regular porn is not already filled with these motives. Even in its mildest version, the mildest version of porn, what porn is showing us, like, I don't know, 80, maybe 90% of the time, is actually sex with no hands involved. And this is not how we authentically desire. Sorry, I'll repeat that. I see your look. Sex with no hands involved. Okay. If you're not going to give up watching porn, so next time you do watch, just notice that porn cameras have no interest in capturing any normal sensual activities, such as petting, caressing, making out, touching, hugging, kissing. No. What porn cameras are into is the penetration. So normally, the composition will be a man and a woman, hopefully just one. Okay, so one man and one woman. His penis is inside her. Don't be picky. It doesn't matter where inside. Somewhere inside her there is a penis. His penis is somewhere inside her, okay? And in order to not block the camera for doing this extreme close-up on the penetration, he's standing with his hands behind his back most of the time. And the woman is in this uncomfortable position, and she needs to handle the penis inside her without damaging the hair or makeup work done on her, because that's money invested and time invested in her, without disturbing his aggressive movement, and mainly without blocking the camera. So the result is that we got two people having sex, different shapes and acrobatics or something, but they're having sex when the only body parts that actually touch each other are the penis and the part being penetrated. No hands involved. Now, I talk, I don't know, 250, 300 times a year. Soldiers, students, pupils. No one has ever come up to me and say, Ran, you know, that part with sex with no hand thing, that was my authentic desire. Like, when I was 11 or 12, I never wanted to kiss anybody or touch them. I was not curious about that. It was all penetrations to begin with. No one has ever said that. Before porn. After porn. In my private fantasies before watching porn, there was always a very strong narrative. And the narrative was of sensuality and mutuality, which means that I had always imagined what I will say to her. What would she possibly answer? What options do I have to respond? In real life, it never works like I planned, but it was super important in my mind in terms of arousal, the build-up, the location, the setting, where will it be? What are the circumstances of me and her being all alone all of a sudden? How will this bodily inflaming between us will emerge step by step? It was super important before porn. After making a habit out of porn, it conquers your mind and it invades your brain, and I lost my ability to imagine, which means I found myself, and I won't be too explicit, but trying to masturbate, just closing my eye, trying to fantasize desperately about something human and not making it, because my head was bombarded with all those images of women being violated and subordinated and forced into pretending they enjoy diabolic sperm rituals, okay? So this is pretty much the result. And we are all vulnerable to pornography. It's not just young people. And we should be very careful, I think, with not only what we put into our bodies, but in terms of food and nutrition, in what is the nutrition of our mind, because everything we watch invades us. I'll give you a short example from non-sexual areas. I came back home, and my beloved one was watching some cultural junk. She was watching a karaoke show, auditions, the one with the chairs spinning. And we don't have a TV set back home, okay? We don't have a TV set back home, but only because it allows us to falsely present ourselves as deep and profound people. Wait, I know, oh, no, I never heard of that. Mastectomy, who? Angelina, I don't, never, no, we don't have a TV. We watch every cultural junk possible, okay? Not me, not her, we don't contemplate about l'existence. We download stuff. And we download all cultural junk. So I'm watching this 20 minutes karaoke show, and it was so boring and tedious, okay? 2 minutes talking, 4 minutes blabbering about it. I lost patience after like 20 minutes, and I went off to take a shower. And the most interesting part was in the shower, because what I found out there was myself in my most pathetic ever. I'm going to share it with you. I want to feel that you actually accept me and love me, so I have to share my most pathetic, and you have to accept it now. I don't know until I got over myself if it took me, I don't know, 5, 7, 10 minutes to realize that I'm standing under the water in the shower, pondering severely what would have been my song for the auditions. Deep and profound, mind you. I won't be doing this Rihanna, Lady Gaga, I'll be doing Mercedes Sosa, Como un pájaro libre. I'll be doing a cover for Bob Dylan's Blind Willie McTell. Ain't that deep and profound? I had to realize that I'm an idiot because I have no talent for music. More than that, I never wanted to be neither a musician nor a singer-songwriter. This was never a part of my inner world of wishes. Okay, but I'm a human being. What can I do? I was watching that for 20 minutes. It entered my brain for a while. So if we take this example and we just try to measure or estimate the impact of 20 minutes of watching no matter what, how it invades our mind and conquer our wantings and desires, let's just try to imagine, or I can share with you horribly, what is the impact of 20 minutes of watching porn once, twice a week, nothing unmoderated. It's overtaking. And porn is in our households whether we want it or not, and I believe that it does not agree with our well-being. And because we have internet in the Western world all over the place, almost in every cellular phone now, we've got 90% of 12-year-olds watching porn on a regular basis. And it has both an addictive effect and a paralyzing effect. It's addictive because we develop somewhat of a dependency in porn, but the paralyzing part is because, mainly for young boys and men, because porn is teaching us that as a man, you are solely valued in sex by having a large penis and an eternal erection. According to porn, being a valuable sexual partner does not relate with being sensual, passionate, attentive, generous, well-coordinated. None of the above. It is all about large penis and eternal sunshine, which we don't possess. So boys become paralyzed, and if they don't become paralyzed by watching porn, very often they turn into imitators of what they saw, which means they become aggressors. Aggressors, even when emotion is involved. Like, there is so much sexual abuse going on nowadays within the confines of what we perceive from the outside as beautiful teenage love stories or healthy adult relationships, because we don't really talk about sex. We just see it all over the place. We don't really talk about it. So what goes on in the confines of a certain room, but these are all sexual mutations that happens. If we talk about women, it's not only that, but young girls and women get the message, not only from hardcore porn, but from our porn-influenced mainstream culture. Have you seen any Miley Cyrus, Lady Gaga video clip, commercials? That's porn with clothes on it. So girls get this notion that if you want to be worthy of love, first and foremost, you have to be worthy of sexual desire. And now, the definition of sexual desire almost equals be like a porn star. So I work in dozens and dozens of high schools and junior highs. In every single one of these schools, I find girls that at a certain point agreed to be documented in an intimate situation because they wanted to please some guy that they had feelings for. And this guy misappropriated their trust. Always same story, so he sells it on WhatsApp application or on the web, in the internet. And normally nobody even addresses him in terms of moral. But it is always girls that suffer from shaming and mortification. They can change school, they drop out normally, change school, move to another city, and still be haunted on social networks. They develop clinical depressions, severe eating disorders, as if we don't have enough reasons in our culture to develop eating disorders. They become so isolated socially. So some of them, like Amanda Todd, rest in peace, some of them actually commit suicide because they find no more value in life or in themselves. So porn is not only in our house, it is a capital case It is not a minor phenomenon in our society. It is a question of life and death sometimes. It is mainly a question of life and death for the people who participate in porn, because porn is not an embodiment of freedom of speech, freedom of occupation, blah, blah, blah. No, it's an embodiment of sex exploitation working side by side with human traffic, raping, pimping, solicitation. For every one porn star with a book contract or a production company, we've got hundreds of thousands of women and girls who does not survive out there. Literally, they just don't make it. The sex industry just, how do you say, chews them up and spits them back into brothels, into hooking in the street, escorting, massage parlors with happy or unhappy ending, depends who you ask. And I'm not joking, this is serious life. This is the whole spectrum of prostitution. So many of them doesn't even make it to the age of 50. I'm talking countries that the average life expectancy is 75, 76 years now. They don't make it to the age of 50, for reasons mainly. Drugs, STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, being murdered by a John, a pimp, a boyfriend. And the fourth reason is suicide once again. Because if you're a prostitute, on camera or off camera, you're in the situation that we can refer to as social death. We have all sat in the dinner table with people who probably consumed prostitution, that have been to a brothel once, twice, at least. We never sat down to the table with a prostitute, not with a declared one. So that's social death. It is not glamorous, not at all. And when I sit in the privacy of my room and I watch porn, even without paying, no need to pay, it's free, okay? I hope you know that, if you're still consuming. Whatever I'm watching is creating a demand, and wherever there is a demand, there will be supply. There's a correlation. If I watch pornography of black older women, somebody is going to go out and pimp black older women. Asian minors, somebody is already trafficking Asian minors in order to film them, okay? Israeli women, Palestinian women, WASP, all-American college girls, that is strong in the last few years, it's a very upcoming category. The scum of the earth are already out there trying to solicitate and prostitute these women on camera. So I stopped watching porn for my personal well-being, my intimate communication, my private erotic life, my, reclaiming control and responsibility over my mind. But by doing that, I actually stopped contributing to this horrible sex industry, and that's a good thing to do, I believe. And I would really like to propose that notion of physically and emotionally safe sex. Emotionally safe sex. It does not mean going back to be conservative or unliberated sexually. I'm all for sexual freedom. It just means that we need to put genderial hierarchy aside, subordinates aside, and bring back in, let's just say, laughter as a critical mass for intimacy. Two souls, two humans, two souls alone in private. Can they please have a laugh together? I don't care if they know each other for a decade or for an hour. If two souls alone in a room does not manage to have a laugh together, what good could possibly grow there, sexual and non-sexual? That's emotionally safe sex. I've got so many things I really want to share with you, but I feel like my time is almost up. So I just really want to ask for us to speak about these issues more, because I strongly feel that our history of silence never did us any good, because silence only perpetuates more silence, while talking normally gives birth to more talking, more sharing, more identification, more awareness, more change. Small change in our small, humble life, but real change, a true one, emotionally safer. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so, enlarging this sexuality frame. So, homosexuality and heterosexuality are social constructs. These are both at the macro level, where society determines what same sex relationships mean, and at the micro level, where individuals obtain their own sexual identities. So, the term sexual identity and sexual orientation. So, sexual identity, really these things are interesting. So, orientation again, how you're classifying yourself, how you identify, and then how your orientation is, who you desire to be with. So, sexual identity and sexual behavior may differ, because gender identity and sexual identity tend to get mixed up, but there are distinctions and definitions. So, for example, in some cultures, men are still considered heterosexual if they have sex with men as long as they are the penetrator, right? So again, that's a cultural definition. I can give you plenty of examples of that. I teach sexualities at Casa Flirgen, and we talk about this a lot, how it's a very culturally derived definitional structure, right? For transgender people in our culture, living in the gender role of the opposite sex, or again, opposite sex is kind of assumption that there's only two, right? But again, we know biologically there's five. They may identify as heterosexual, but have same-sex relationships because they're transgender, right? Does that make sense? So your gender identity is just your, expression and feeling of your own innate gender. And your sexual orientation is just who you're attracted to and who you love, right? Different. So, these things kind of get mixed up because people often can't suss out the difference because of these, again, heteronormative assumptions that, the way that you're biologically born will connect to a specific gender identity, which then will connect to a specific sexual orientation. That's just not the case, right? And again, even these things are kind of expanding the way that we understand them. So when it came to, the sexual revolution, the meaning and place of sexuality in America really went through a lot of changes, right? It moved from a very family-centric reproductive system in the colonial era when we started talking about this in this class to focus more on romantic sexuality within the 19th century. So by the 1920s, sexuality became a major source of identity and self-discovery. So for the next decades after the sexual revolution redefined sex as a right for individuals and not something just for procreation, right? Once we hit the 60s and we get the sexual revolution, it becomes this idea that, women should also have the right to have sex and enjoy it, and it not just be based on having a child. And so, there were larger economic and social changes in society that were also linked to this change, such as the rising age of marriage, educational convergence of men and women, women's growing rights and autonomy, right? The invention of the birth control methods, so like the pill or the IUD or others, the rise in the number of single people when the baby boomers reached sexual maturity, and of course, the social movements that coalesced around that time, right? That were actively rejecting sexuality and rules of previous generations, like the anti-war movement, the hippies, all that kind of fun stuff. So, in modern times, sexuality is highly commercialized, and it's supposed to provide sexual identity, or this really individual identity and happiness that's apart from reproduction. But it's pretty messed up, the way that it's just become something that is a way for us to sell things. And so what we're not selling is liberation anymore. So advertising and entertainment in the media have been forces contributing to this sexual permissiveness because really sex is used to sell almost anything today. So I'm going to show you a video here of a short TED Talk done by Jean Kilbourne, who's a scholar that really looks at how women are represented in the media. And, she really looks at how advertising has this specific fixation on youth, on beauty, and it's so fake. It's photoshopped. It's not even real. So the problem, though, is that real women and girls compare themselves to this image, and the real men in their lives judge them based on these images as well, knowing that they're photoshopped and not real. So anyway, I'll show you this clip so she can explain that to you.
I started collecting ads and talking about the image of women in advertising in the late 1960s. As far as I know, I was the first person to do this. I tore ads out of magazines, put them on my refrigerator, and gradually I began to see a pattern in the ads, a kind of statement about what it meant to be a woman in the culture. I put together a slide presentation and began traveling around the country. In 1979, I made my first film, Killing Us Softly, Advertising's Image of Women, which I've remade 3 times since then. These were some of the ads in my original collection, a long time ago. Feminine odor is everyone's problem. If your hair isn't beautiful, the rest hardly matters. Honey, your antiperspirant spray just doesn't do it. And I'd probably never be married now if I hadn't lost 49 pounds, which one woman told me was the best advertisement for fat she'd ever seen. I'm going to do a very abbreviated version of this talk, of course, today, but I want to begin with the question that I most often get asked, which is, how did you get into this? What got you started? Many factors in my life led to this interest. I became active in the second wave of the women's movement right away in the late 1960s. I'd worked in media. I spent a year in London working for the British Broadcasting Corporation and a year in Paris working for a French film company. This sounds much more glamorous than it was. I was a secretary. In those days, options for women were very limited. I was a secretary, I was a waitress, but I did have one other option that I rarely talk about. I was encouraged to enter beauty pageants and to model. This is artfully cropped to make it look as if I won. I was in fact the runner-up. This was my first ad, and I think the car tells you something about how long ago this was. And this ran in a London newspaper. So modeling was one of the very few ways that a woman could make money in those days. It was very seductive. But for me, it was also alienating. It was soul-destroying. There was a whole lot of sexual harassment that came with the territory. So I didn't follow that path. But it left me with a lifelong interest in the whole idea of beauty and the power of the image. Since that time, advertising has become much more widespread, powerful, and sophisticated than ever before. Babies at the age of 6 months can recognize corporate logos, and that's the age at which marketers are now starting to target our children. At the same time, just about everyone feels personally exempt from the influence of advertising. So wherever I go, what I hear more than anything else is, well, I don't pay attention to ads, I just tune them out. They have no effect on me. I hear this most often from people wearing Abercrombie t-shirts, but that's another story. The influence of advertising is quick, cumulative, and for the most part, subconscious. Ads sell more than products. Now, in many ways, we've obviously come a long way. But from my perspective of over 40 years, the image of women in advertising is worse than ever. The pressure on women to be young, thin, beautiful is more intense than ever before. It's always been impossible. Years ago, the supermodel Cindy Crawford said, "I wish I looked like Cindy Crawford." She couldn't, of course. No one can look like this, but it's really impossible today because of the magic of Photoshop, which can turn this woman into this woman and then try to make us believe that an anti-aging cream can do this. Now, she's a beautiful woman, but older women are considered attractive in our culture only insofar as we stay looking impossibly young. We learn to read men's and women's faces very differently. Here we have Brad Pitt and former supermodel Linda Evangelista, about the same age, each one of them in an ad for Chanel, but he gets to look like a human being and she's transformed into a cartoon. Now sometimes, every now and then, a celebrity resists. And as you may know, just this week, Lorde sent out a tweet with an unretouched photograph below the Photoshop version. And she tweeted, "Remember, flaws are okay." Good for her, but this doesn't happen very often. Men are Photoshopped too, but when men are Photoshopped, they're made bigger. Andy Roddick laughed when he saw the bulked up arms on this cover photo and suggested they should be returned to the man they belong to. The obsession with thinness is worse than ever because of Photoshop. Her head is bigger than her pelvis. This is an anatomical impossibility. The actual model for this ad was fired for being too fat, and they used Photoshop to create this freakish image. More recently, they used Photoshop to remove the dreaded thigh gap. Unfortunately, they also removed a very important part of her body. So the image is impossible for everyone, but particularly for women of color, who are considered beautiful only insofar as they resemble the white ideal. Light skin, straight hair, Caucasian features, round eyes. Even Beyoncé's skin is lightened in ads. The image isn't real. It's artificial, it's constructed, it's impossible. But real women and girls measure ourselves against it every single day. Of course it affects female self-esteem, and it affects how men feel about the very real women in their lives. Women's bodies are dismembered in ads, and ad after ad for all kinds of products. And sometimes the body is not only dismembered, it's insulted, as in this amazing ad that ran quite a few years ago in a lot of women and teen magazines. This is the whole ad, and I'll read you the copy. Your breasts may be too big, too saggy, too pert, too flat, too full, too far apart, too close together, too A-cup, too lopsided, too jiggly, too pale, too padded, too pointy, too pendulous, or just too mosquito bites. But with depth styling products, at least you can have your hair the way you want it. It is ludicrous, but this ran in teen magazines. Teen magazines target 12-year-old girls. Here they're saying to 12-year-olds, your breasts will never be okay. So our girls are getting the message today so young that they have to be incredibly thin and beautiful and hot and sexy, and that they're going to fail, because there's no way to measure up to this impossible ideal. The self-esteem of girls in America often plummets when they reach adolescence. Girls tend to feel fine about themselves when they're 8, 9, 10 years old, but they hit adolescence and they often hit a wall. And certainly part of this wall is this terrible emphasis on physical perfection. Men's bodies are very rarely dismembered in ads, more than they used to be, but still it tends to come as a shock. This ad ran about 20 years ago in Vanity Fair. These are all from the national mainstream media. And it was one of the first examples of turning men into sex objects. But when this ad ran, about 20 years ago, the ad was so shocking that the ad itself got national media coverage. It's a good thing it got some coverage, I suppose. Reporters called me up from all around the country and said, look, they're doing the same thing to men they've always done to women. Well, not quite. They'd be doing the same thing to men they've always done to women if there were copy with this ad that went like this. Your penis may be too small, too limp, too droopy, too lopsided, too narrow, too fat, too pale, too pointy, too blunt, or just 2 inches. But at least you can have a great pair of jeans. It would never happen, nor should it. And believe me, this is not the kind of equality I'm fighting for. I don't want them to do this to men any more than to women. But I think we can learn something from these two ads, one of which did happen, one of which never would. And what they show us very vividly is that men and women inhabit very different worlds. Men basically don't live in a world in which they're, well, let me move on to another. There are stereotypes that harm men, of course, but they tend to be less personal, less related to the body. However, men are objectified more than they used to be, but there really aren't consequences as a result of that. Men don't live in a world in which they're likely to be raped, harassed, or beaten. At least straight white men don't live in such a world, whereas women and girls do. When women are objectified, there's always the threat of sexual violence. There's always intimidation. There's always the possibility of danger. And women live in a world defined by that threat, whereas men simply do not. The body language of women and girls remains passive, vulnerable, submissive, and very different from the body language of men and boys. And probably the best way to illustrate that is to put a man in a traditionally feminine pose. It becomes obviously trivializing and absurd. Grown women are often infantilized in ads, and increasingly, little girls are sexualized. Now, I've been talking about this for decades. I wrote a book about it, and it's getting worse. This little girl is 9, and this is happening in a culture in which there's widespread sexual abuse of children. Images like this don't cause this problem, but they certainly normalize very dangerous attitudes towards children. Padded bras and thong panties are sold for 7-year-olds in major department stores, and the latest product, high heels for babies. Not to leave boys out, you can get t-shirts for your toddlers that say things like Pimp Squad. So boys are sexualized too, although in a very different way than girls. Boys are encouraged to look at girls as sex objects. Boys are encouraged to be sexually precocious, and boys are learned to be tough and invulnerable, basically starting in infancy. Basically, we allow our children to be sexualized, but we refuse to educate them about sex. The United States is the only developed nation in the world that doesn't teach sex education in its schools, but our kids are getting sex education. They're getting massive doses of it, but they're getting it from advertising, the media, the popular culture. This is an ad for jeans, although something seems to be missing. But each one of these ads for major international products, major mainstream media, very graphic. The problem isn't sex, it's the culture's pornographic attitude towards sex, the trivialization of sex. And nowhere is sex more trivialized than in advertising, where by definition it is used to sell everything. Whatever you're giving him tonight, he'll enjoy it more with rice. I don't think I'm particularly naive, but I haven't figured out yet what the hell you do with rice, you know. Maybe it's wild rice. One woman shouted out she just hoped it wasn't minute rice. So this is an old ad, of course, and you can say, well, sex is always used to sell, and that's true. But it's far more graphic and pornographic today than ever before. And just to illustrate that, I'm going to show you an old ad using, this is an old ad using sex to sell food, and here's a current one. Burger King, the Super 7-incher, it'll blow your mind away. For a mainstream product, as is this one. Now, all of these images, I think, are actually profoundly anti-erotic. Because in advertising and the popular culture, sexuality belongs only to the young and beautiful. If you're not young and perfect looking, you have no sexuality. And this makes most people feel less desirable. How sexy can a woman feel if she hates her body? The internet has given us all easy access to pornography these days, and as porn becomes more available and acceptable, the language and the images of porn become mainstream. Young celebrities emulate the porn stars, and these days you can get your little girl a pole dancing doll. Girls are encouraged to present themselves as strippers and porn stars, to remove their pubic hair, and to be sexually available while expecting little or nothing in return. And at the same time, they're insulted. Tastes great, goes down easy. As girls learn to sexualize themselves, as they learn that their sexual behavior will be rewarded, they learn to sexualize themselves, to see themselves as objects. These images cause real harm to real girls and women. Girls exposed to sexualized images from a young age are more prone to eating disorders, depression, and low self-esteem. Inevitably, the objectification leads to violence, and that's become much more extreme too. Advertising often normalizes and trivializes battering, sexual assault, and even murder. The truth is, most men are not violent. Overwhelmingly, most men are not violent. But many men are afraid to speak up, are afraid to support women, and are afraid to challenge other men. And I have great admiration for those men who do. These ads don't directly cause violence against women, but they normalize dangerous attitudes, and they create a climate in which women are often seen as things, as objects. And certainly turning a human being into a thing is almost always the first step toward justifying violence against that person. And that step is constantly taken with women and girls. So the violence, the abuse, is partly the chilling but logical result of this kind of objectification. So in all these ways, things have gotten worse, but in one big way, they've gotten much better. I am no longer alone. There are scores of films, hundreds of films and books and organizations like the Brave Girls Alliance, which recently had a great event in Times Square. Media literacy is being taught in our schools. There's political action taking place around the world, and I have an extensive resource list on my website that lists lots of these things. I'm inspired by young activists like Julia Bloom, who at the age of 14 launched a petition to 17 magazine, asking them to limit their use of Photoshop, and she succeeded. Here she's celebrating with some of her allies and inspired other girls to do the same. This generation gives me hope. But we have a long way to go. The changes will have to be profound and global, and they'll depend upon an aware, active, educated public, people who think of themselves primarily as citizens rather than primarily as consumers. We are all affected by these images. We all have a profound stake in challenging them. We must create a better world for ourselves and our children. After all these years, I still have hope that we will. Thank you so much.
And so, like Jean talked about in the video, the media's fixation on sex has served to involve children and youth earlier and earlier in thinking about sex and sexual activity. So girls in this ad over here are from left to right, 16, 14, and 12. But they're hypersexualized. They look like tiny Victoria's Secret models, right? And this is for a California clothing retailer. This is just an example of one of millions of ads out there that normalize to teen girls that their primary importance is how they look. And this motivates girls to internalize this sexualization and learn to sexualize themselves. So when it comes to scientific research on sexuality, national surveys have found substantial changes in women's sexual behavior over the past decades, but smaller and significant changes to men's sexual behavior. So the most valuable part of the new surveys on sexuality is that they look at sexuality in a social context, meaning that people's sexual choices are shaped by the social networks in which they operate. Because obviously, who you come in contact with is who you're going to have sex with. So the National Health and Social Life Survey that they talk about in your book found that adultery is the exception more than the rule, meaning that 75% of men and 85% of women never cheated on their spouse. Still continuing with the National Health. People in the US are divided into 3 groups according to how often they have sex. A third of them have sex twice a week or more. A third have sex a few times a month, and a third have sex a few times a year. And when it comes to incidents of homosexuality, about 2.8% of men and 1.4% of women report a homosexual identity. And when it comes to what kind of relationships married couples have the most sex, they're more likely than other groups to have sex. They're more likely than single people, and they're also more likely to experience orgasms as a result. And of course, questions still remain about, some of the methodological issues of some of these studies. But anyway, Global Study on Sexual Attitudes and Behaviors. They surveyed 27,500 middle and older adults in 29 countries on the subject of physical and emotional qualities in their sex lives. And they found that the highest levels of sexual well-being were found in Western countries where gender equality is the highest. So gender equality means better sex lives. Okay, so when it comes to AIDS, between 1981 and 2010, more than 1.13 million Americans were diagnosed with AIDS. And AIDS spread, right? It had, it was really responsible for changes in sexual attitudes in America. So the knowledge of how people were infected with HIV virus motivated a lot of people to stay away from unprotected sex. So the problem was that in the early 80s, when the disease was first discovered, there was a very flawed thought process that assumed that AIDS itself was a homosexual disease, meaning only affecting people that were homosexual, or also another marginalized group, IV drug users, right? And so as a result, the assumption was that it was just these marginalized groups that were being affected by it. And largely the Reagan administration did not intervene in the way it should have in the early years that really could have prevented the widespread epidemic issues that resulted so many infections and so many deaths that could have been prevented early on. But really, there was this kind of deviance aspect, right? Meaning if you're a very marginalized person in society, if you're a homosexual, if you're a IV drug user, then someone like a conservative president isn't probably going to care too much about, what's happening to your community. It wasn't until a lot more heterosexuals started contracting the disease and dying that they started actually putting a lot more funding and research and money towards finding a cure. So 3/4 of women who were diagnosed with AIDS were infected through heterosexual contact. So again, it was a misnomer, their belief system in the early years. And HIV itself has increasingly become a disease of color, with African American men being diagnosed at a rate 7 times higher than white men, and African American women being diagnosed 20 times higher than the rate of white women. So African Americans make up only about 13% of the population, but that account for 46% of all new AIDS cases. And so this is a problem because you can see that there's a disproportionate impact within these communities, and of course that's also related to social class and access to healthcare, right? Okay, so when it comes to teen sexuality, adolescents today have more sexual freedom than the preceding generations, and they've become sexually active earlier than their parents. We also live in a very highly sexualized culture that pressures teens to be sexually active. So, approximately 54% of teenagers have had sexual intercourse by the time they finish high school, so more than half. And the average age tends to be 17. This is the average, but then there's some variations, of course, by race, by class, by gender, in regard to who has sex in their teens. This early sexuality puts teens at risk for teen pregnancy, STDs, STIs. Having intercourse at young ages is associated with more partners, less protection, and more likelihood of non-consensual or unwanted sex, aka rape or sexual assault. So the US has the highest rates of teen pregnancy. We're number one. It's like those things are always like the worst things, right? And part of this has to do with the lack of sex education in schools, right? So sex education in schools is a very controversial topic. So as a long-term strategy, abstinence education was used for many years across the US, right? Like there are, obviously these things vary state by state, right? But there's no national legislation that promotes having actual sex education taught in schools. And if you did have sex education in your school, because if you lived in California, you probably did, because that's part of California law, but it's only like a couple hours in a health class that you had in high school, and that's about it. And it's usually like a cross section of like female anatomy, male anatomy, where you're like, this is where the ovaries are, or this is the vas deferens, or whatever. But that doesn't really teach you about actual sexual activity, consent, healthy sexual relationships, any of those things that teens really need to know to engage in informed sexuality. And as a result, they end up in often like dating violence relationships or very predatory or, negative relationships as a result of just not having a basic understanding of what should be, because we don't teach them, right? Because, we don't want to teach teenagers. And what's the assumption? Oh, well, if you teach them about sex, then they'll have sex. It's like they're teens, they're going to have sex, right? So this abstinence education, it's pretty unrealistic in the current social context because premarital sex is now the norm rather than the exception. So just telling kids not to have sex at all is not really a great strategy. So the federal emphasis on innovative approaches and evidence-based programs for preventing unintended pregnancies, HIV, and STDs is really what's needed. All right, so when it comes to teenage childbearing, over the past several decades, teenage childbearing has been seen as a major social problem, right? Something that we don't want in our culture. When it comes to racial dynamics, Hispanics or Latinos are more likely to have teen pregnancy than African American teens. And, early motherhood is something that can really make young women vulnerable, but not necessarily poor. It depends on where you started. So teenage pregnancy does correlate with poverty, but the correlation means that the most teen mothers who were poor before they got pregnant, not as a result of their pregnancy, they were already poor, they tend to stay poor. So being a young mother poses challenges as young women try to navigate school and work with a child. So there's a figure in your book, 8.2, that shows racial differences in the teen birth rate between 1991 and 2010 by race ethnicity. And, the U.S. teen birth rate for 2010 declined to 34.4 live births per 1,000 teens, which represents a historic low for teens in all categories. So that's a good thing. All right, when it comes to differentiated forms of intimacy, the more significant dimension of sexuality is gender. It relates to the social context of sexual behavior and desire. So women and men want and expect different things from their intimate heterosexual relationships. There's a very specific heterosexual script, social script, of how men and women are supposed to desire things. So the expectations and styles of love vary by gender. So this is a problem because the model for male sexuality stresses performance, the actual sexual performance itself, while the female model stresses the emotional relationship. So men tend to be more casual about sex. They can easily compartmentalize their feelings about love and sex, while women view sex as a bonding experience. So some researchers feel that sex is the main domain in which male dominance is reinforced and female subservience is reinforced, because the mainstream acceptance of pornography and porn culture has led to a sex script that sex is an act that's about male desire, instead of like two people actually having a consensual relationship. When it comes to same-sex orientation and intimacy, there's, some variance from societal norm of heterosexuality that was legally prohibited until 2003. So there was this thing called sodomy laws, right, where basically they were used historically to selectively enforce and make deviant homosexual communities. So when we hear the term sodomy, we tend to think of anal sex, but that's not actually what it means. Sodomy just means any non-procreative sexual act. And when a lot of these sodomy laws were first put into place, they were supposed to supposedly target anyone, meaning if you were married, if you were single, if you were straight, if you were gay, if you had any non-procreative sexual act, that was criminal. But you didn't see them like knocking down the doors of husbands and wives who were, in the confines of their own home having very consensual non-procreative sexual acts. It was really something that was used to specifically target homosexuals, because you can basically, in the same way we talked about drug criminalization, if you can criminalize a person's behavior, you then criminalize that person, right? So if you can criminalize a Chinese laborer saying that he smokes opium and that opium smoking is illegal, you can criminalize that Chinese laborer. If you can criminalize the act, any sort of same-sex sexuality as criminal, then you associate the sexual act with the person, whether or not they even had or engaged in any sort of sex, and you criminalize the person as a result, right? So yeah, that's a whole nother problem. So there's obviously a lot of missing support out there for gay and lesbian couples when it comes to the issues that they face. And so the conditions that people face, this is a problem. So gender is really an important part of this. Whether you're heterosexual or homosexual, gender is going to be a factor. So lesbians are more likely to establish long, loving, committed relationships, as heterosexual women themselves are striving to do, while homosexual men are more likely to develop relationships on the basis of having sex. And again, there's so much research that shows the variance within this, especially in regards to race and social class and such. But this is just more on like a generalized level. So the gendered understandings of relationships affect heterosexual and homosexual relationships because they structure expectations and goals. So the conditions under which sexuality and love are experienced vary. With social class, however, differences are becoming less clear. So, a study from your book discovered that the lower class inclined towards a no-nonsense, silent approach to sex versus a self-conscious, elaborate approach of higher classes. So especially in regards to how people have sex, what kind of sex they have, oral sex, foreplay, whatever, like it's usually, for the wealthy, this is more drawn out compared to the poor, who typically, get it done without all the frills, right? So I think that, again, you could really analyze that as a social class-based perspective, is who has more time to have sex, who has more, a financial ability to buy all of the little trinkets and things associated with sexuality, to explore that kind of stuff, right? Obviously, social class could have an impact there as well. So, let's see. When it comes to the experience of sexuality and love, this also varies by social class. So while most people uphold the ideology of love, there are class differences in resources to sustain that ideal. So intimacy in marital relationships is also affected by economic conditions. It's not as if poor women just care less about the emotional aspects of their relationship than rich women, right? But poor women are more focused on the necessities of their life than their emotion first, right? Like if you're just trying to get by, you're not necessarily worried or deconstructing every word of the fight you had with your husband, right? So of course, differences of color, culture, ancestry, those things are going to create clear sexual boundaries. So when it comes to race and intimacy, throughout the U.S. history, right, powerful sexual stereotypes have been central in creating and sustaining the racial hierarchy. So there's this myth of the black rapist that was really created in the Reconstruction era, when there was this fear after slavery ended and before Jim Crow was instituted, where the white Southern elite were afraid of insurrection, that people that they had enslaved and tortured and, oppressed would come and try to like overthrow them or hurt them or something. So there was this myth that was created and again floated through films like Birth of a Nation, right? Things like that, that promoted this myth that black men are hypersexual, that they're interested in raping white women, and that white women need to be protected because they are like the vanguard of, your womb is important because it's, a nationalistic womb that will produce white babies. So it's this really messed up thing that comes from actually like during the Reconstruction era post slavery. But there's still this narrative in the culture that black men want white women, that black men are hypersexual. It all comes from a specific origin point within our history. So despite current trends in multiracial dating, the sexual marketplace is still a minefield for people of color, right? Their choice of intimate partner is defined by a racial hierarchy that places white people at the top. So when it comes to claiming or, control of this intimacy, because intimacy is socially constructed, it offers the possibility for agency and growth, meaning because it's something that we define through our interactions, it means that we can change our interactions and change the definition. So we do have the power to change the things we don't like about dating and intimacy and sexuality and all of these things, but only if we're aware that we have that power. So sexuality has been separated from reproduction. In a lot of ways, this has really helped women because it's given them a wider range of options of educating themselves, of going to school, of doing those things, and being able to control and regulate when they have children. So people throughout society are struggling to transform intimate relationships and to enhance pleasure and love, to have better, more connected relationships and, of course, sexual relationships, right? Because really that's something that's very important to the way that couples understand each other, to the way they connect with each other, and really to promoting a long-lasting, happy relationship.